1 week from tonight, we'll be talking about opening statements in the case against Derek Chauvin, the man accused of murdering George Floyd. This case is too important to miss, so think about it, okay? Where are you going to watch the case? You've got to watch it here on Court TV. It's our cameras. Our microphones are inside the courtroom, number one. Number two, gavel-to-gavel coverage. Number three, the most in-depth analysis that can give you some sense of context of what you're watching, why it's important, what's coming up next, and what it all means. So your front row seat to justice is the place to be for the trial that is too important to miss. Speaking of too important to miss, closing arguments starts now. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, huge developments in day 10 of jury selection in the death of George Floyd murder trial, as we are just 1 week away from opening statements.
When you learned that you were a potential juror on this case specifically, what was your first reaction?
But who are the jurors that have been struck by prosecutors and by the defense? And what patterns do they reveal about who each side does not want on this jury? Tonight, we take a closer look. In tonight's Unsolved case file, Cleveland's first serial killer, we take a closer look at the torso murders which remain unsolved since the 1930s. Could it have been a local doctor?
There's no sense of closure, not for the families of the victims and not for the public.
On the docket tonight in Pasco County, Florida, the movie Popcorn murder trial. A young dad is shot and killed in a theater by a former officer who's claiming self-defense. Tonight, we speak with the victim's wife.
I remember feeling this should have been over. He's got what he wanted. Why is he still doing the ha-ha, you did what I told you, I won?
And in Atlanta, Georgia, new surveillance video from the spa shootings. What does it reveal? Plus, the 13th juror speaks. Tonight, we take a look at your reaction on social media. I'm Vinny Politan. Thanks so much for joining us here on Closing Arguments. I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so, and I always tell you so. So those of you who've been watching me or have been watching Court TV through the years, you know that you can always find a jury, no matter what the case is. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how big the case is, how opinionated it is, how much evidence has been made public. It just doesn't matter. You can always find those jurors who will come into court, perform their civil duty, and be fair and impartial, and answer the questions that the judge asks, and the judge can look at them and say, yeah, this juror can be fair and impartial, and both sides can agree to who those 12 people are who will sit in judgment in the biggest cases across the country. And right now, you know, we're in the midst, or actually we're pretty close to opening statements. We have that magic number. There are 14 seats inside the courtroom, 14 seats for jurors. 12 of them will deliberate, 2 ultimately will be alternates in the case. Now, jury selection is continuing into tomorrow, but tonight we have hit the magic number with 14 jurors cleared to serve in the case against Derek Chauvin, the man accused of murdering George Floyd. And the selection of juror 118 as the 14th is my biggest moment of the day.
Why did you have a somewhat negative impression of the officer to a neutral, and why would it be important to get more information?
The somewhat negative is just the constant showing of it, I think, for a while there when it first occurred, and just the reaction from the community as well. Just the constantness of that, I think, made me believe it was the somewhat negative, and the reasoning for my answer on that. But the neutral side of it was, I'm always thinking about the person and, again, where they came from, what they've been through, experienced. And my neutral side of that was that his training to do that based on what occurred, and I didn't see the whole thing to be able to know whether that is what occurred.
Okay, so ultimately the question of police training or police practice may be a part of this trial. You're not a police officer, right?
Correct.
And I know you said you've had some training as a social worker to kind of deal with potential threats. Would you be able to kind of set aside what you may have learned and pay attention to the police practices as presented in court?
Yes.
Let me ask you, in terms of your impression of Mr. Floyd, can you explain kind of, there's a wide spectrum, you kind of hit the whole spectrum there. Can you explain that a little?
I think that's part of where I come from, is always looking at every side of things. I'm always looking at why someone may have done something a certain way. His experience before with law enforcement, I thought about his family, because I saw the family so much on the news. So again, I had all kinds of thoughts on him with his past. They've talked about his past with drugs and things like that. I had every emotion, I think,
Right.
about him. So.
Juror 118 is now the 14th juror who's been approved, the magic number 14. She's a white female in her 20s, employed as a social worker, wants to help people, neutral regarding Black Lives Matter and neutral regarding Blue Lives Matter. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what you call a fair and impartial juror, number 14. Let's bring in Court TV legal correspondent Julie Janae, joining us live from Minneapolis tonight, as the real countdown now begins to opening statements 1 week from tonight. But we hit our magic number, 14, Julia.
We did hit it, even though the judge does want one more juror just as a backup, because he does not want anything to go wrong between now and opening statement. So they are still in the process of finding that 15th juror, but that's like the 6th man on a basketball team. It's someone who's going to be dismissed on Monday. 14 is the number that this court wants.
Well, we don't have time for it now, but I was the 6th man on my team in high school, so the 6th man can be very important. But it's for a different time. But yeah, so we're going to continue this jury selection process, but we've gotten 14. Is there any way to gauge this last juror? She's 20 years old. She seems kind of young, but I really didn't hear anything one way or the other that would be any red flag if I was sitting on either side of that courtroom.
She seems so open-minded. That's what really struck me in listening to her talk. She agreed that social workers are empaths, that she takes her time in hearing discussion. She's usually the quiet one and really observing everything that's going on. She was really neutral about a lot of things, but didn't seem to be it wasn't hard for her to express how she felt about the emotions that she felt seeing the video, and how she felt about George Floyd's family. But at the same time, you could see that her background as a social worker, she likely sees people in critical moments all the time, not just someone who may be in the position of George Floyd, but maybe even someone who was in the position of Derek Chauvin. And you see that question that she had about wanting to know more about his training really shows that she's really trying to understand both sides.
Yeah, that part really struck me as well. Generally, when I was a prosecutor back in the olden days, the more senior prosecutors in the office would always tell me as a prosecutor, stay away from those social workers. But in this case, everything's kind of thrown out the window. I think you're in opposite land most of the time. But when you hear her actual answers, folks, it's tough to draw a conclusion other than this. This is someone who might be a great juror. Let's take a listen to more of her, because like many Americans, like many people, she had discussions about the case with family members. Let's take a listen.
Have you, in any discussions with anyone in your immediate family, heard strong views expressed about this particular case?
Yes.
And I guess, can you share with us what views have been expressed about this case?
I specifically to this one just have been involved in those conversations of he should not have had his knee on the neck for that long. Nothing in regards to it not happening at all, mostly for how long it was, but that was the majority of that conversation.
And this was a close family member?
Yes.
And what effect do you think, if any, that knowing that opinion, coming into this would have on you if you sat as a juror in this case?
I don't think it would affect me. It hasn't changed my view so far.
With your family, you wondered what caused or prompted the knee on the neck based on the training received by Derek Chauvin and all officers. And then on Twitter, you wrote that you were scared for the state of Minnesota as we were told violence was moving to the suburbs on the news.
Yes.
So you were obviously aware of the unrest that occurred after Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes.
And that caused you some fear?
Yes.
Okay. And you had heard some stories that it was expanding beyond the Twin Cities proper?
Yes.
Again, in terms of the training, you would understand that, again, that is a bit of a contest or perhaps conflict in this case. Do you understand?
Yes.
And would you be able to set, any of those discussions that you've had with family members or friends about what they think police training says about this incident aside, listen to the evidence from both sides and make your decision based on that?
Yes.
And once again, Julia, it's we had a little streak where we were getting some jurors that weren't quite as young as some of the others. Some might call them older jurors, but this one in her 20s kind of fits in with what we were seeing early on.
She does. She's also an advocate of sorts. She's going to be joining two other advocates who are on this jury that deal with homeless people. And she talked about having experience with those who are under the influence of drugs or struggling with drug abuse and substance abuse. So a lot of those factors will come into play likely. Those experiences will help her as she's sitting there as a juror. But I was a little surprised that after hearing that the defense didn't exercise a strike, but they chose to allow her to be on this jury.
I think the key is being open to the training and also, some of the concern about the riots. I think that kind of may have balanced it for them a little bit, but I get what you're saying. But compared to some of the things that other jurors have said, right, it's all relative. I think she fits in well. Let's take a look at the jury makeup right now with the final 14 that we have. And we've got 5 male jurors, 9 female. I mean, it seems just like yesterday, Julia Janae, we were talking about, where are all the women on this jury? And now women pretty much in charge of the whole thing.
Just had to let the process play out.
Yeah, well, you seem like that's like the way the process is supposed to play out, right? Women in charge. But anyway, let's go back to the age issue here, Julia. 9 jurors under 50, 5 jurors over 50. Again, skewing young, and I think the real question is going to be, how do they communicate with one another in there? Do the younger jurors look towards the older jurors as the leaders, or just people from a different generation? To me, that's a fascinating dynamic with this particular jury.
It is. I think that communication is going to be so key. That's why I was hearing this potential juror who is now seated juror number 118, the way that she described things and the way that she even said that she has to learn communication styles. When she first gets a client that she's working with, she has to understand how to relate to them. So someone who's able to communicate effectively with all of the jurors, I think that's going to be more important than what age they are, because it seems like each of these potential jurors who are now panel members, they all have a similar temperament of wanting to compromise and wanting to work with the other person if there's a conflict.
And finally, let's take a look at the racial component, which many people believe is always one of the most important, although it's never a reason for striking a juror. That's illegal. You've got 8 white jurors, 4 black jurors, and 2 multiracial jurors. Look at those numbers. If it was just 8 white and 4 black, that's almost the breakdown of Hennepin County, at least in terms of of white jurors. It's pretty, pretty close. It's like 75%, what is it, like 65, 75%? So it's relatively close. So whoever the two alternates are, I mean, it could break one way or the other in terms of whether you get a majority of white jurors or an even split.
And the thing about the alternates is they won't know that they're alternates, and we don't know if we will, as the public, know which of them are the alternates. It's entirely up to Judge Cahill's discretion. He can pick the first two, he can pick the last two. We're assuming that it might be the last two, just because that's usually how things shake out when there's jury selection, but completely up to the judge. It could be a lottery system where he just randomly picks two, but they won't know while they're hearing the evidence.
And I don't think they should. I mean, some jurisdictions, they let the alternates know they're alternates, which is fascinating. When I practiced, it was nobody knew until the end. You picked two names out out of the bin, and that's how you found out at the end. But it'll be interesting. We've got the magic number 14.